Welcome to episode 7 of the Sesh. Today we have Nathan Hunt, the Sporting KC Academy affiliate, director of coaching with us here for episode 7. We're very excited to have Nathan on the show. And I believe Nathan is going to be taking us through a session that is designed to help coaches better understand how to coach middle to attacking third. So Nathan, we have you on. It's great to have you on, Nathan. How have you been?
Good. Can't complain too much. I know we all could, but doesn't do us any good. Good to see some familiar, friendly faces also. So looking forward to the episode.
Awesome. And speaking of those familiar faces, we do have our panel once again. Ross Moffitt, Director of Player Development from Iowa Soccer Association. And back on the show, first time as a panelist, Ian Barker, Director of Coaching for the United Soccer Coaches on as well. Ian, Ross, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Great to be here again.
Always the best. It's been a really challenging week again here in the Iowa landscape. How are things, Ian and Nathan? I know you touched a little bit, but how are things going as far as COVID-19 return to play where you guys are?
Nathan, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll start off. Kids are playing here, so that's a good thing from the youth soccer scene. A few counties are in our what we call phase 2, which I'm sure a lot of areas are calling that, where it's restricted playing, you can't necessarily compete, etc. But in most areas, they're able to compete, have games, have scrimmages. So I guess this is the new normal. I don't know how many times I've heard this, but there's some normalcy in terms of the youth soccer scenes. So some of the other scenes, that's a whole nother conversation. But all in all, clubs are back on the field. Players are back on the field, and parents are happy with what's going on with the clubs right now.
Yeah, my feedback in the Kansas and Missouri areas, we're right on the border, is that there's a fair degree of return to normalcy. So my coworker Allison, her 3 kids are playing full time with their respective Legends and Rush clubs. They're starting to compete. So although we have some challenges, I think overall at an entire state level in the youth sport realm, it seems to be going okay. It might be the actions of 20-somethings in college that causes us more problems down the line in losing access to youth sports. But right now, Kansas and Missouri are actually competing pretty well.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that, Ian. We're getting obviously Ames, Iowa's been in the news, unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons the past week. So we're kind of a hotbed of coronavirus, and it's definitely got us worried a bit on what the next few weeks will look like for us. So we'll have to stay tuned and see where we are there. But let's focus on coaching education today, because that is what we're here to do. So episode 7, as we always do here on the Sesh, we will go through and talk about one of our favorite players to ever wear that uniform number. And so I will kick it off once again, and I will throw everyone for a big loop for those of you 20 consistent viewers of the show, and I will go with Beckham.
Ooh,
Number 7. I think the German winger, Pierre Littbarski, maybe wore 7. He's an older generation player. Ronaldo, not bad, really. He's a pretty good number 7.
Okay.
Yeah. And then if we're just talking the position, you probably in modern day, you'd pick Robin or Ribéry playing off of one of those flanks for Bayern Munich. So there's no shortage of decent number 7s in world football. And somebody might even say that De Bruyne is an erstwhile number 7 at times. He's not bad. So yeah, plenty to choose from.
Yeah, number 7 is kind of a prestigious number, isn't it? There's been some absolute classic players, but I have to go with my countryman, best ever Scottish player, Kenny Dalglish.
Yeah, good call.
7's an interesting one. Ricardo Quaresma. Remember the Portuguese guy who loved to come inside on his head, kind of set the tone a little bit for Robin, etc. Not that he's your traditional 7, he's an inverted winger, but that's a good. Obviously, Ronaldo is one that's really important, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, Griezmann wears a number 7 for France, right?
Yeah, he does.
I am a fan of Griezmann. So I would have to say, for me, Griezmann and Quaresma, because I like the creativity. So
Did anyone, so I was doing a little bit of research on this, but so did George Best wear 7?
I think he wore 11.
Okay. I wonder if
I think if you Google most of the time, you'll find him wearing 11, because back in the day, he would have been off the left flank and they would have been very strict with the numbering system.
Okay.
Yeah, that was way before squad numbers for the season, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Just had
there's probably some footage of him with 7 on his back, though, I would imagine.
We'll just go with that just to make me feel better. So, all right. So Nathan, we'll let you jump into your session. So if you want to take over the screen share, we'll get into your first activity. And we'll chat about it a bit and see what we got.
Yeah, definitely. And before I share the screen, just wanted to, as we talked about offline, give a little bit of context. So been delving a lot during this time. COVID has given us time to research, acquire new knowledge, acquire new skills, et cetera. So that's one thing I've been doing as an educator, is trying to get more and more knowledge. And so I thought about potentially using some things I had previously done and tweaking them, updating them, but I decided to go ahead and use the tactical periodization training methodology, and then use our U.S. Soccer's orientation learning implementation. So it kills a little bit two birds with one stone, a little bit of continuing education for myself, right, and expanding my knowledge, but also it gives context. And I think that's something very important as we go through these sessions, whether it's today, your future sessions, et cetera. There needs to be a contextual component to why we're doing it. So we're doing attacking today, right? And we moved to the middle third. So I know we had a good conversation and went back and forth on whether to defend or to attack. But another thing to keep in mind, utilizing that tactical periodization and OLI, as it's called, is you essentially get to train both sides of the ball to an extent, although you have a focus. So I'll let you take a quick gander at these. If you're familiar, 5 Ws are created for each session to give even further context on what the players are going to be doing that day. And also for us as coaches to make sure that we have good context and perspective on what we're looking at. So the goal came from the principles that I created from a game model that I created. So, and that's another reason I wanted to give context, was I came up with a specific style of play that I would like to see my teams play with. So I'm very excited to see when we go down to Florida, if we do, Ian, being able to use this game model going forward. But then from there, out of that style of play, I pulled out principles that I would potentially like to see on a regular basis. And real quick, those principles are creating opportunities to move the ball forward as soon as possible, creating and finding numbers up situations to disorganize the opponent, and using the half spaces and areas between the opponent lines to create chances. So today, what we'll do is we'll focus on the general principle of creating and finding numbers up to disorganize the opponent, which is primarily a principle I would like to use with the players in the middle third. So from there, the team tactical principles, which for me, these are the sub-principles that I would like to focus on based on this general principle, are using dribbling opportunities to eliminate players and lines, and then making runs to disrupt the opponent in coordination with the full line or group of players that you interact with on a regular basis. So from there, we'll focus on the middle third. The key players that we'll look at are the 6, 8, 10, and 9. Now, keep in mind, more players will be involved in the session, but when it comes to coaching points, et cetera, those will be primarily focused on those 4 key players. The moment is, the opponent's been set in the mid block and is looking to take away those central channel and half spaces. And then for me, this is a session, not a mastery session, but an improvement session. Not that the players are necessarily doing something wrong. We just want to keep giving them a better understanding of how to align with their teammates, and how to solve these problems when they come up in the game. So let's go to our first exercise. This is the warm up. And what I'll do is, Damien, I'll show you let me know if that's big enough.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, perfect. So what we have here I set up, this is based on 18 players, right? So we set up a 3v3 plus 4. So the 2 at the top here are targets that can be played to. The 2 wide are essentially what would be considered 2 or 7 here, 3/11 here. This grid here with the 3v3 is approximately probably 50 yards by 50 yards long by 40 yards wide. This one that has the 2v2 based on having less players, I set for about 45 by 35 in terms of length and width. The way that they score, I get the ball from here. So blue figures out how to get the ball from point A to here. I get a point, right? Now, one thing that I've done with this is you have the opportunity to immediately make this directional, or you can make it multi-directional, where if I get the ball here as the blue team, we get it to this target, we then turn around and go the opposite way. Depending on where the players were at in their development stage and the understanding of what we're doing, I would probably say, hey, you could either start right away, but at some point in time, I would make sure it was directional before I moved on to my next activity. So no touch restriction in this activity. One thing to keep in mind, though, is one wide player can come inside. So as one wide player is coming in, the other one has to stay outside. As soon as they get the ball, as soon as they play the ball, though, they can get out, right? So this wide player goes inside, this left wide player stays out wide. But then as soon as he or she goes back outside, this wide player can now go outside. So it's something to keep in mind of when we're trying to disorganize the opponent. Sometimes it's coming from wide spaces, sometimes it's coming into places between the lines, etc. So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, and that's one reason that manipulation is in there for the activity. And then the restarts will begin either up here. We've set balls with the coach, him or her can start it. And really for me, it goes based on the flow of the activity and what kind of repetitions do you want to get. Yes, we want the blue to get as many repetitions as possible, but the idea is to still make it realistic to where it's not constantly being the other team playing defense, etc. There does need to be a flow so that the players can truly figure out how to solve that particular problem. So when we look at that, the objective of this exercise, first and foremost, get the players activated physically and mentally, and then introduce the general principle of how we will disrupt the opponent. So those sub-principles that I showed us earlier, the players would be informed, hey, these are the two things that we're looking to focus on today. So when you're out here playing, be sure that you're keeping those in mind when we're in the active intervals. And then actions for those players would be, and we start off with the actions a little bit more general in the warm-up, just to get them going and to essentially scaffold it. Getting their starting and adjusted body position addressed. So what I mean by that is players usually typically have a good idea of what their starting position looks like, but as soon as that ball moves, what does your body position look like again, right? Are you constantly adjusting your body position to get into the best situation possible so that we can accomplish our goal, accomplish our objectives that day? And then the other one is just to start to make proactive runs. So not necessarily me telling them do these type of runs, etc. It's more of, are they just as essentially taking their own initiative, being aggressive and assertive to make different types of runs and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And then for the opponent team, the objective would be, again, activate players physically and mentally, but then also prepare them to defend by staying connected, right? So that's the objective. Is the red team needs to be able to stay connected when they're defending. So then that way it should lay the groundwork for what we're going to do going forward. And then the actions would be a coordinated pressure and cover, and then delaying by cutting out dangerous passing options, which the dangerous passing option in this activity would be obviously getting it to the target. So let me stop there. Let's see if there's any questions or comments from you guys as we before I kind of move on with either some more of this activity or anything else.
Yeah, definitely a couple. Ian, do you want to jump in first? And
yeah, so Nathan, because you've gone with sort of a function, you've intentionally put your midfielders inside, obviously, length and depth players in green and width players in green. Sometimes in a youth environment, we would just say everybody out, everybody in kind of thing. With a higher level group, you're going to keep them in these functions, right? You're not going to let everybody have a go at everything. You're going to kind of be a little bit more positionally specific.
Yes, that is correct. So there should, based on 18 players, everyone would be playing if these two activities are set up. they would be playing primarily in their function that they normally do on match day. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is goalkeepers would be involved in this also. So that 18 wasn't just 18 field players, it's 16 plus 2, right? So there could be a goalkeeper here, so he or she could then also start to get an idea of what it looks like from behind in terms of supporting the team.
Ross, you might have a question as well, yeah?
For sure, yeah. I always got soccer questions. I think, first of all, Nathan, I really like that you tied it into your game model and provided a little bit of a context, because I think oftentimes in youth soccer, we jump in and we just start coaching without actually really clarifying what moment of the game is actually, being taught within the objectives of the session. So I thought that was really cool. One thing that I think might be helpful for the viewers is maybe just before we progress to the other activities is just to dig in a little more on the OLI methodology, because I think, Damien, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this might be the first time we've had a Sesh episode with this methodology. So it might be helpful to kind of describe what that is for those that haven't experienced it yet, before we move into the other activities.
Yeah, definitely. So OLI is the teaching methodology that's primarily been developed by U.S. Soccer Coaching Education Department. And it stems from a very holistic, reality-based experiential point of view when you look at how to train the players, right? But it also stems from tactical periodization, which 100% takes a holistic point of view and look at, you can't separate, everything systemic, right? It is the thought and the plan from it. You can't take one thing out and train that. So as we all know, we've kind of gotten away from the separated training and even the economical training that we all went through, and things are starting to become a little bit more holistic, not completely, and there's still a place for that, but it's a choice that's made, right? If you're going to do tactical periodization, you then have to teach in a way that keeps it consistent with being holistic. So when we talk about orientation, the first and foremost thing we have to do is make sure that the opponent that we're coaching that day in training is creating the soccer problem that's on the field. So for example, this would be a potential example of why a problem that the opponent created for us this past weekend was making sure that they took away central areas and half spaces and made us figure out how to go around them or go through them. So that's a soccer problem that's been created by the opponent. And we have to make sure that we recreate that to the best of our ability as a coach, right? So my coaching actions are to make sure that I'm getting that team set up, the opponent set up correctly. They're in the same shape. They have some of the same principles. And then from there, once that problem's been created based on what we either anticipate or what we've seen, now the idea is, how do we help the players learn a solution, multiple solutions to that problem? And so now there's a teaching component of, now I work with the focus team a little bit more to say, all right, do you recognize that there's a problem? And whether they verbally or non-verbally tell us that. And then, okay, now you finally recognize there's a problem. You're trying to find a solution on your own. Us as coaches then get to step in and say, all right, here's some possible solutions. And then you go in and use your typical coach's toolkit, right? Whether that's freezing the play, whether that's, talking to them during natural stoppages, whether that's talking to them during the flow of the activity, et cetera. So once they then had an opportunity to succeed and fail in trying to accomplish or try to utilize a solution, then we as coaches, not necessarily sit back, but we let them try to implement the solutions on a consistent basis that they've come up with or that we've co-constructed with them as coaches. And you do that for each activity. So it's not just where one activity is I orient the team, right? And then the next activity is I do learning, and the next activity is I let them implement. I do all three things in one activity, right? So there's this constant back and forth of making sure that the opponent's still doing what they need to do so that the problem's still realistic for the focus team. And that's why I kind of mentioned at the beginning that this is an opportunity for coaches to end up coaching both sides of the ball, because you have to make sure that the players are doing what they need to do on defense And gone are the days, at least in this teaching methodology, where, hey, I'm just going to focus on the attacking team. I don't really care what you guys do. I'll be candid and honest. I did that more than a handful of times as I was coming up as a coach, saying, hey, you guys, here's what you look like, boom. And then I never talked to those group of kids again. Well, they come to training and then I never talk to them for more than like 2 minutes. Yeah, that's not a great experience for them. So that's a quick snapshot of OLI. That's almost a whole nother podcast series and potential episode, but hopefully that helps, Ross, with the content.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it helps to set the scene a little bit as we move through the rest of the session.
Yeah, awesome. And which kind of leads into another thing. One thing that we need to be cognizant about is like how I would potentially coach. So in this warm-up activity, I probably wouldn't do a lot while they're actually playing, other than maybe some positive reinforcement. I've listed some key words down here. So for the attacking team, I would say break the line, new body position. Those would be key words that I would try to tie to the concepts. And then for the defending team, it would be coordinated and cut the danger. So then they can tie those keywords. And I would use those keywords throughout the rest of the training session. Not adding any more, maybe cutting down to one if I needed to, but it would be something where as I'm talking to them during the rest periods, I would then say, okay, like here's what we're talking about. Continue to think about this. When I say break the line, it's tied to how we're making our runs and disrupting the opponent, et cetera.
I've just got two quick questions, I think.
Yeah.
And one of them is just curiosity, and the other one is more just if I were going to run the session, like how would I advance this? So you're going target to target. So what I'd imagine is the 4 or 5 playing through the midfield 3 going to the 9. So is there any times, like based on what the defenders are doing, is there different ways to score that you would kind of progress? Like, could we go straight into the 9 and then you'd have to score by having one of the midfielders receive underneath? Or is it just straightforward for you in middle 3 and then to the target?
Yeah, I think it's really comes back to what objectives you set for that day, Damien. So if I ran this session 3 times over the course of a season, right, I'll probably evolve how they score, right, to add complexity or to decrease the complexity based on where they're at. So 100%, if it could be one of your objectives is, hey, I really want to focus on how our frontline players bring the midfield players into the play. That would be what you just described would be a way that I would let them score in this activity, where it has to get to the target, but then you need to connect it to one of the midfield players before it's a point. So 100%. And those are just the objectives I chose, but you could easily maneuver in the session. But then it comes back to, are you getting away from your objective set, or did your objectives evolve that quickly in the training session? So 100%. There's all types of different ways, right? As you guys are seeing, the activities I've come up with aren't like these groundbreaking, like outside of the box activities and setups, etc. For me, the meat of it is the content and the structure and the organization that I've done as a coach beforehand to make sure that there's less management that I have to do on the field and I can do more coaching and observing.
Awesome. And then my second question was just, I fully get like not having touch restrictions on the midfield 3, and I wouldn't do that either. Would you in any case put touch restrictions on the outside players just to kind of pick up the speed of play from them if it gets to be a little bit unrealistic?
That would be my back pocket. So I personally always start with no touch restrictions, and then if I need to put them on, I do so, unless I'm specifically working on something that really entails like having to play within 1 or 2 touches. But for me, I want to make sure I don't take away the opportunity for players to dribble to solve a problem if I don't have to.
Okay.
And,
cool.
And that's one reason too, Damien, where these players are able to dribble in. So if they can't make a pass, it's not we've all seen the activity, right? The defense does a good job of matching up with everyone. And then now we're standing and waiting. This opportunity, this ball potentially goes here, right? This player can dribble in. Now they're part of the play. Now, not only thing is the wide players can't score, but they can pass to anyone, right? So now these players are able to maneuver and figure out how to get there. And then I've also put here, I didn't put it in the rules immediately, but I think I put it in the notes. This player could potentially dribble in also, to your point, if you're seeing the flow of the activity stall. So then that way, there's always the potential to say, do I dribble or pass? Because that's at the core of it. That's what we're doing as soccer players. Everyone has to decide, do I dribble or pass when you have the ball?
Awesome. I love that.
Or shoot.
No, that's a really good piece to add in there. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I think unless anyone else has anything, ready to move on to your second activity.
Awesome. Let me get to that. All right, so let's go to activity 1. So I set this up. So as I mentioned, there's 18 players in this session, but what I did is I diagrammed both sides. So you could potentially have the option of, okay, we're gonna work on the left side of the team first, and then we'll flip over to the right side of the team for the second half of this activity. You could stay on one side the whole time if you wanted to. I didn't want to say that I had 22 players just to make the session, make the activity work. I wanted to do something that was a little bit more realistic, which we all know even getting 18 players at training with the full field isn't the most realistic thing for a lot of environments, but I didn't want to manipulate the numbers to just make it work because of putting together the activity. So this isn't both going at the same time. This is first, second, if or, totally up to you as a coach, what you would want to do. So let me start off by saying, there we go. All right, so space is about 60 yards long by about 36 yards wide. As I said, you can work both sides of the team or stay on one side. So I've set a offsides line / line of restraint. So this is one of my favorite activities when working with midfield activities, is to have this line in here, and not only having the line, but then having an additional space to get into and play. So they can break this line, right? And then they can go in and score. But once they break the line, now the whole space is available, right? And then for the opponent team, they can play in the whole space anytime they have possession of the ball. They're not restricted to being in that space. Anytime the ball restarts, we always start in front of the restraint line. So, and then the opponent team can break that line off the dribble or pass. So this is one thing, a little bit to what you said, Damien, you know, if there's certain things that I want to see or I'm not seeing, I can change this, but they can break it with either the dribble or the pass to start off with. So again, I'm trying not to take away decisions or potential solutions for them unless I have to, based on what they're doing. Let's see, and then restarts will occur primarily with the focus team, but it also can come from the coach. And then when, as we said, we set up balls all over the place. If the ball does need to, in order to not break the flow, I do have balls set here so the opponent team could start the play again. So you as a coach, you got to have a gut feeling on the rhythm of the activity. And are you accomplishing what you set out to accomplish that day? And if it makes sense to let it start wherever it needs to restart, great. If not, it's up to you to make sure that you do that as a coach. Throw-ins are live here on the outside. So if you're working on the left side, throw-ins would be live here. On the right side, throw-ins would be live on the right side. And then the opponent team has one counter goal to score in, which is a little bit shaded towards the middle on purpose. And then the focus team has 2 counter goals that they can score in from there. So these teams are set up, and this is important now that we're getting into a little bit more functional activity. They're set up in for the focus team, they'll attack in a 1-2-1-2, and they'll defend in a 2-1-2-1. And then for the opponent team, they'll defend in a 2-3-1, and they'll attack in a 1-2-3. And I forgot to say this at the beginning with the context point of view. I set up our focus team in a 4-3-3, and then I set up our defending team in a 4-4-2. And I purposely picked a 4-4-2 because typically what we end up doing a lot of times is training everything based on the game format that we play, the game system or formation that we play. And our opponents don't always defend in the same way or attack in the same way that we do. So it's good to switch it up, but then it's also good to do that as a coach. So then you can see if your principles are truly principles or if they only fit within one system and formation. So this gives the players some context. So now they know what their role is and what they should be doing during the session. So here, 6v6. So we have for the, let me blow this up a little bit more for you guys. There you go. We'll look at this left side. So we have the 9, the 10, the 11, the 3, the 5, and the 6. So one thing to keep in mind, what we're focusing on for this particular one is, make sure I got my notes in front of me, sorry. There we go. Nope, that's the last one. So what we'll do, there we go. There we go, sorry. Sorry, I got too many pieces of paper in front of me, so my apologies. For the focus team, so their objectives for this activity is start to recognize the cues that disrupt the opponent's shape, and then also gain an understanding of taking the correct positions to set up dribbling opportunities. And then the objectives for the opponent team are create opportunities to win the ball in wide areas and allow no dribble penetration in central areas. So let's focus on the actions that I would like to see of the players on the focus team. So this starts to go to the key players that I mentioned, the 9, 10, 8, and 6. So for the 9, start off by occupying the center back, primarily on his or her weak shoulder. Another key point for them to keep in mind is the 9 and 10 should switch positions when there's dribble penetration forward. So here in this graphic, you see the 3's picked up the ball, and based on the distance and location of the opponents, he or she's decided that, hey, there's some space for me to attack and potentially disrupt the shape of this opponent, right? So now that's a cue based on the principles that we would like to see the players play with is, hey, these 2 players get to switch, because that's the principle that anytime we see dribble penetration, we could potentially switch where we're at. So now maybe a little button hook run for the 10. And because of that, the 9's realizing that, hey, I can kind of shade off a little bit more and then come into the space that the 10's leaving. And this is just one option that they could potentially use to solve the problem, right? Because of based on where the 2 and the 4 are, hey, I can split these 2, I can get there, and I can play this pass and get into the space. But I say that there's these actions that I give the players potentially, but the context is always, hey, these are examples, right, for you to use. And sometimes these will work 100% in the match or in a training, and sometimes they won't, but it gives them a foundation to figure out, hey, these things work, these things don't work. I could tweak this potential option to solve the problem. So continuing with the player actions for the focus team. So the 10 or the 8, depending on which side you're on, making sure he or she always starts between the defensive and midfield lines and stays in between players in those lines. Further actions would be the 11 and 3 or the 2 and 7, keeping a staggered line, but also with that staggered line being about 12 to 15 yards apart, coordinating the timing of their runs. All right, so that's something that if you look here on the right side, the 2's checking in, well, to make sure that they keep a staggered line, that means the 7 has to get out, right? So it could potentially pull that player out. It could potentially not. Well, hey, maybe this doesn't work the first time because the 11 stays here when the 2 comes in. But because of that, now we recognize, hey, this pass isn't here anymore, but I could potentially use this one, right? Because, and this also depends on these players here. So just gives them options. And when we give them particular actions that we would like to see based on the principles we put together, that will help them make decisions on the field. Continuing on, the 4 or 5 dribble penetrating and looking for forward diagonals. And then the 6 playing between the forward and midfield line as much as possible. So we see that player kind of getting into those spaces here. And then the 11 and 10 or the 7 and 8 interchanging as a ball player, interchanging as wide player comes inside and back towards the ball. So it's not just good enough for this player to come inside, right? He or she could be running across this line. They need to come inside and then check to the ball in order for these wide players to potential, or these central players to interchange with them. So again, giving them some context. So it's easier for them to make a snapshot decision because we've already given them a little bit of information on how to solve the problem. And then finally, I do address the 1, and I won't address it here, but I do address him or her going forward. But just some general ones for all the players. It's run with the balls when space is available in front of you, and engage on the dribble when received on the half turn between lines. All right, so if this player gets the ball and he or she's facing their own goal, hey, don't necessarily try to turn and dribble, right? But if you can get yourself in a position to open up and see part of that line or all of that line, yes, we want you to start engaging with those defenders to start moving them. So, and then for the opponent, making sure that they're keeping the problem the way that we need them to. This player, actually the 9's here. As I mentioned, they play a 4-4-2, but I have them defending in a 1-4-5-1 when they go 11v11. So this weak side 9 drops into the midfield line to create a line of 5 in the midfield. So that's an action that we would want the 9 to make sure that he or she's doing when they don't have possession of the ball. In theory, it would be between the 2 8s, but for this activity, it would be on the weak side of the 8. The 7-11, cutting off forward diagonal passes to the 9 or 10. And then the 2 or 3 matching up with the opposing 7-11 as the ball moves into wide areas. All right, so here, the likelihood that the ball is going to move into a wide area is slim to none. So this player doesn't need to go match up, at least at this moment. But there may be a moment where maybe the 7 is a little bit shaded over here. If they're anticipating and reading the play well enough, the idea would be, hey, as this ball's traveling, you need to get there and match up with him. So now it takes away the potential advantage for them to turn and go at us or get behind us there. So, and then I also mentioned there, do not track the ball if they move inside, but pinch closer to the center back. So at times we'll see maybe this player starts to move inside. This player would not necessarily track him, but just make sure they get closer in covering position to pass him on to the 4, right? So now they could recognize the moment if that player is running across, they could potentially track him if they needed to, if they move forward on a vertical run, but we don't want them to track all the way across, and now there's holes left open for someone else to run into. All right. I said a lot in that. So I'll pause for a second and see if you guys have any comments, questions, etc. with that particular activity.
Appreciating this is the second activity. What were your thoughts about breaking up the 6-8-10 and kind of going split field? So ultimately, your focus is 6-8-10-9.
Yeah.
But at this part of the training, you've got 2 6s working with an 8 and a 10 and a 9 and a 9. What was the thought about breaking up that triumvirate in this part of the session?
The only reason I did that was because I essentially split the team in half, Ian, to work on one side of the field. I did think about potentially doing this in a central area only and only having one example and showing an activity. But I decided to do that because I wanted the wide players involved in this activity. Not that they were necessarily key players, but I wanted to work on the interaction between these players with the wide players. So that was a decision I made for that. So again, remember, like these two aren't going at the same time. So it could be, the 6-8, these players, this 10 is rotating with the 8 during substitutions, and our backup 6 is rotating with the starting 6 in this position. So they wouldn't be going at the same time, but that was a decision I made there was, hey, because I only have 18, I want the wide players involved in this session so that way it gives good context to the central players. I decided to say, hey, let's just split the team in half so that I have the appropriate numbers. Because when I looked at this, in order to get all the players on the field, it was going to be a 10v10 if I open this up all the way. And I decided against that because then that put me at least 20 players needed for the session.
Yeah, I love that. I did middle to attacking third with my 19s yesterday, and I had it down the middle, and my 7 and 11s kind of got lost within the activity, to be honest with you. And so I think that's really good stuff, and definitely taking notes here. So, yeah.
Nathan, a lot of your sort of key objectives for this, your learning objectives, if you will, for this activity are based on sort of, interaction between players, reading the cues. If he or she goes there, maybe I can go in here. Can you speak to kind of the way that you might insert yourself as a coach and teach that?
Yeah.
It's a more organic activity. I'm sure you're not, you're not doing like pattern work or anything within that. So could you speak to how you might help to bring that out?
Yeah, great point. So here we are here with that. This is where I put my notes where here's some potential solutions for the kids, right? So it's not just completely that, hey, go figure it out, right? At some point in time, if they're not figuring it out, us as coaches, our job is to help them get there. So what I did is I wrote in my notes here's some options that we could use to help them start to figure out what the solutions are. So option one I say is the 7 or 11 check-in, the 2 or 3 time to run for a one-touch combo with the overlapping player. And then the 9 in that instance, using multiple runs to support and get into the box or get into the space behind the back line. Another one would be the 7 or 11 fake the check-in and run and go back out wide with the 2 or 3 checking in and play to the 9 or 10, making a run towards goal. So that just starts to give them some potential options of what they can do. And then we would obviously show them, maybe it's a freeze, maybe it's a quick demonstration after coming back from a stoppage on here's some options that we could do to start to solve this potential problem. Does that answer your question, Ross?
Yeah. I just think, it does. I just think it's important that we, I know we dive deep into the organization of the activity in the sesh, but sometimes I think it's important to also address the teaching methodology and how that might occur within the activity. So yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, and 100%. Like there may be players where I may position myself, for example, in this area as a coach because I want to talk to the 6 on a consistent basis where he or she is to make sure that they're constantly not necessarily hearing me give instructions, but I can reinforce something that they've done well. During the stoppage, maybe I can talk to them real quick so I don't necessarily need to disrupt the whole session if I'm focusing with the player, or I could even maneuver myself up here, right? So now I can constantly give the 9, some advice on things. So, and then obviously I'm going to probably get in at some point in time and say, hey, like, all right, good job, opponent, creating a problem, consistently doing that. You guys have tried to find some solutions. Freeze, let's take a quick moment and see what happens potentially when we do this, or what happens when we do this and try this solution going forward. And that comes back to, how many solutions do we want to give the players, right? It really depends on where they're at individually and then collectively as a group and team. If it's a newer concept, you're probably looking at maybe 1, maybe 2 solutions max. If it's something where they're, exposed to it and they know already what we're looking to do, now we can really start to delve into the different, options we potentially have, or even them helping us create the options themselves and giving them a little bit more ability to experiment. So no, I appreciate that question because it's important.
I just got one more quick one, and I think your objectives kind of tell the story. But for those who might have missed, why the goal off-centered for the one team?
So one of the principles defensively is preventing central penetration. That's me paraphrasing it a lot. So even when the focus team loses the ball, I want to make sure as a coach, all of our principles are consistently being ingrained. And so I don't want us defending out in these wide areas and holding our space there consistently. Like I want to make sure that we're, A, they're moving towards the middle of the field, and B, they're also adhering to the principles that we're trying to do throughout the whole season, right? So it's the big picture part of things, of making sure, even though the focus team is doing this, if we're looking at it from a holistic point of view, at some point in time in this activity, they're going to defend, right? Hopefully you would think they would defend. So they need to make sure that even though I'm never going to probably stop play, freeze it, or necessarily talk to them specifically about the defending function, since I'm focusing on attack with them, I still want to make sure I've organized a session that they stay in line with our principles as a team. The other reason to keep that in mind too is look at where our players are. If I move this goal a little bit wider, what'll happen is the 3 will probably start to shade out there and protect the goal. And then this line gets disconnected when they're defending. So there's a couple of reasons for that. It's just mainly though, it's trying to keep it realistic. because that's the most dangerous part of the field, right? Here, we're trying to get into these spaces, so we may use one or both, or one or the other, to get in behind the line there. And then as you'll see in the next activity, we move on to a little bit more complex situation.
Awesome. Yeah, so definitely if no one else has anything, we can move on then to that next one.
Okay. All right. So what I did, based on us being 18, I put us in a 9v9 scenario, right? So I wanted to go on a 2/3 pitch full, functional activity, but only having 18 players, having to take some players out, I felt was going to be unrealistic to some of the behaviors the players would need to utilize during the activity. So I decided to go with the 9v9 instead, which in turn I had to make sure I kept the 9v9 formations in line with how they would, what formation they would play at 11v11, but also then how they would attack and defend. So with that said, what I did for that is 9v9 conditional match, approximately 90 yards by 65 yards wide. So I've set the focus team up in a 1-3, there we go, a 1-3-2-3. And so they attack in a 1-1-3-1-3, and they defend in a 1-3-1-3-1. And then for the opponent, I set them up in a 1-3-3-2, and they defend in a 1-3-4-1, and then they attack in a 1-2-2-4. So obviously, it's not the exact same numbers or the exact same setup that they would do at 11v11, but if they were playing 9v9 still, this would be developmentally how I would probably ask the coaches to have the teams play so that it stayed in line if that was the formation that the older kids used. So I put a line and restraint in here. So anytime play restarted on either, like the teams needed to start back in here. And so this is where the conditional part of it comes into play. Obviously, it's not just a 9v9 game where FIFA rules are 100% in play, start at midfield, etc. I wanted to get them into the situation sooner than later. So then that way we could start to connect what we did in the first two activities to this one. At some point in time in this activity, I would get rid of these and allow them to have a little bit more unconditional play. But something to keep in mind as a coach is that doesn't mean we stop coaching. That means you're still consistently making sure the opponent team's organized correctly and doing what they need to do based on how they're supposed to defend. And then continuing to make sure that the focus team is utilizing the solutions they came up with and finding new ones if potential. And if not, that's where us as coaches, again, come into play. So attacking team, when they have the ball, when we start here, they have to break the line via dribble or pass again to open up the field. But keep in mind, offsides is live. Anytime you're on your attacking half, offsides is still live, right? So these players, if they decide to step up, these players don't get to just hang out here, right? Like they would in, say, the 7v7. They still have to figure out how to solve the problem based on offsides being live in the attacking half. So what I have for them, the player actions and objectives didn't change. Or I won't say they didn't change, they very few changed. And I'll go through some of the changes here in a second. And the reason being is because it's, in my opinion, a much more complicated, complex environment than what I had them in the last activity. So for me, I didn't want to change the objectives and change the actions. I just wanted to see if the players could then figure out how to use those same actions in a little bit more complex and game and match condition type activity, as opposed to what we had them in the previous activity. So pretty much the same there, guys, in terms of how the defending team would play. Here I show another example of the 3 checking in, right? And at the same time, the 11 checking out. But instead of playing to the 3 as these guys are stepping up, now there's the potential, oops, I forgot to put the ball there, my apologies, would play to the 11, right? And so it just shows a different option, but it still addresses the principle of these 2 staying staggered, right? So here's their starting position. Now can they coordinate their movement, right? Because if this guy moves way too late and then we play it here, these 2 can still read it. But if we coordinate it correctly, it's gonna disrupt what's happening here, all right? And then which potentially then allows to see what happens as this 10 comes in, and then the 9 is able to read the play. Am I able to get in because now this player can play a ball in behind here? Do I need to come into these spaces? Do I need to just check into where the 10 left so that I can be an option for him or her there? Well, then also taking into account that, what does the 7 do? So again, just an option there. And making sure that now what I'll do is I'll talk about the 1 because the 1 is involved in this activity. He or she would need to make sure that they're supporting strong ball side consistently, right? So if we only have 1 here when we're attacking, we need to make sure that they're still staggered, right? We don't want the 1 sitting here. We want there to be a safe option if necessary to play here, which would then give us time to open up and then figure out how to disorganize them again. And again, I would go through the same coaching behaviors. And for me, this would be a session that the players have been exposed to maybe for the first time, maybe a second time. And then I would make sure that we're reinforcing the same actions. Because again, the idea going overall was that they gained a deeper understanding of how to align with their teammates and how to play their particular role and how to solve those problems. So I wanted to make sure that the action stayed the same so that they were exposed to several opportunities to either succeed, fail, or somewhere in between. All right. Again, a mouthful. So
Nathan, a couple of questions. One, is it fair to assume that your preference is to end every session in as close to even numbers, 2 big goals activity if possible?
No.
Okay.
Nope. I actually probably, I don't want to say all the time, but I usually like to end in a functional activity going to goal. But I didn't want to reduce the numbers to the amount that I would have had to do that.
Okay. Given the topic, and you've shown here activity 2 and 1 and 2, could you get to the same kind of point, or would you, with maybe an 11v7 and or a 9v9, but maybe like 2/3 of the field, 1 big goal, 2 goals?
You could.
Are there any methodological sort of things that are not in your preference, or that would suggest like a phase of play and or a 11v7, 11v whatever?
Yeah, so I'll kind of, hopefully this answers your question. So I was probably about 90% set on an activity like you just mentioned. And then the reason I got away from it was, in order for methodologically to stay aligned, I needed to have certain players involved so they had the correct matchups. And I decided against it because to get the numbers to work, I would have had to pull certain players out. So I decided, hey, this is an opportunity of, it's not the full-on game, but it's at least a game setting, and both goalkeepers are involved. And on top of that, everyone's involved in the session, right? In an activity. Yeah. Like I don't have to sub people in, which for me then as a coach, especially if I'm by myself, I could potentially then focus even more on coaching because I don't have to worry about managing substitutions. So it's a little bit methodological, a little bit logistical in terms of making a decision there. Would I do that every time? I would probably say no. There may be times where I stay with even smaller numbers because I did flirt the idea of making activity 1 even smaller. So then when I went to activity 2, it got past no more than like maybe about the size of what I did in terms of 6v6. But this is also kind of, I labeled this 15 to 16-year-old players. So for me, there should be some level of context and knowledge that we can get into those numbers on a pretty quickly basis. So the flow was 3v3 plus a bunch of options to 6v6 to 9v9. So for a complexity, scaffolding and the words lost me. But in terms of how we flowed from start to finish, I didn't think there was I never thought there was a huge jump from activity to activity based on space, players, and rules.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Nathan, you've used the word scaffolding a couple times. I think that might be a good one to unpack a little bit for those tuning in. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so one of my co-workers who's an early childhood development specialist really looks into constructivism um, in terms of cognitive development. And I believe that's important for those players that are now adolescents still, right? To make sure that as they're still learning how to play the game, that we scaffold it. So I set a certain level of knowledge, and once you reach that level, right, then we take you to another level. Then we take you to another level. So it's almost the premise of, hey, we're not taking you straight to calculus. We're taking you from, arithmetic to algebra to geometry. Just stats is way out there. I don't like this class of stats, right? Calculus, right? Yeah, so it's making sure we don't jump from point A to point Z. It's making sure that we properly take them through, making sure they hit certain checkpoints, right? So that we know they understand and they understand, and then we add some more complexity to it.
Makes sense.
Awesome stuff. Hey, Nathan, I know you're kind of in a much different environment than I'm at. But how do you guys go about, so not just this session, but when you're just working your sessions completely for a season? So you said that you would be looking to do, perhaps this is maybe the second time you would have covered this topic in a season.
Mm-hmm.
How many times do you cover topics? Are you covering topics based on planned curriculum, or is it more result oriented, or what are you doing within your environment?
Yeah, so it's mainly, and I'll give you context. I don't coach a team consistently based on my position, and I'm not directly tied to the academy, so I'm not with them day in and day out. I work primarily with our affiliates, et cetera, but I won't get into that. So I'm not coaching every day. So some of this is my past experiences. Some of this is a little bit of what I see from the academy, and then some of this would be if for some odd reason my role changed and I was back on the field every day, how I would do it. But the training, the curriculum and the learning plan from, let's just say, 5 years old up to 19 years old would be primarily what we work off of, right? So the optimal condition is the 19s. Like, this is how we want the boys and girls to play at 19. And then we, again, backwards scaffold, and we break it down to what do they need to be able to do at, say, 17, and then 15, and then 13, 11, and so on and so forth. So even when we go into match day, like, the objectives and how I'm going to watch the game is going to be based upon what we've done in training recently. So yes, I'm still going to see what the opponent's doing, et cetera, but the lens and the context that I'm looking at it through is, for example, these objectives that I've set and these principles. And so it depends on a whole lot of factors, right? There's even more context, like how often are you able to train with the players? Is it 4 days a week versus 2 days a week? So I may be able to get through a curriculum topic in 3 weeks because I train 4 days a week. Whereas if I only train twice a week, maybe I need 6 weeks, right, to get through that, because you think about the actual hours, and the hours are much less. So it really depends on 100% of the context of how often you're training, what the level your coaches are, but it's a combination, but primarily it's what's the curriculum, where are we at in the curriculum, and then we build it from there. And the games are tied to the training sessions. It's not, hey, I'm going to sit out and watch and scout the opponent, and this is what they were doing. And well, you got to tie it back to what they've been training and doing, because the games are essentially another training or another learning environment for them. And you still go out and compete, and you still look to try to win the games and make sure you're competitive, but it gives them a filter to look at it through. It gives you as a coach a filter to look at it. And then, to be even more frank, it gives your parents a filter to look at it through, right? So as you're trying to manage them, now you see, hey, like, this is what we've been working on, and here's the objectives. I give those to the parents potentially, and now they're looking at it through a similar lens, right? Not the exact lens, but a similar lens, which then helps manage what we're doing day in and day out. So
no, that's great stuff, and I think it's just it's important for us as coaches to kind of keep a lot of that stuff in perspective. And I think as we've been going through our stuff here where I am, we've had some challenges trying to work through the curriculum and trying to figure out how we're doing things. And I think a lot of times it's very easy for coaches to try to get fixated on match results and wanting to deviate from plans to fix things. And I think and this is, to be fair, I think if people watch this episode, they're going to get a really great sample on how you can take this topic and coach both sides and work on, multiple different, topics and subtopics and ideas that you can do multiple things within one training session and still stick to, the ideas and the curriculum and the process of development for that stage. What do we want our 11U player to look like after a year going into 12U? And so I think it's been very, very good.
I think the principles are important because say you get into a match and you're doing very well, you're not doing well, you can still adjust things based on your principles and still keep it a learning environment, but tweak it based on what's happening that day, right? It's the same thing we would do in a training session if it was too hard or too easy, right? You just have a little less control because it's a match. But if your principles are good, solid principles and you believe in them as a coach, you can still adjust the strategy of how you go about it that day in a match, right? And still stay on topic with what you're trying to teach the kids. So you got to decide as a coach and as a technical leader, what are non-negotiables for you? Like what are 100% doesn't matter. We're playing the French national team. Doesn't matter if we're playing, the team around the corner. Like as a coach, we are going to do these things because I believe in it. And I think it'll help them as a group of players and individuals. So
awesome stuff. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything before we?
Well, I think at a very important level, this is a really tidy 75-minute session. If you've got a good group of players who are organized, you're organized. This doesn't have to be a drawn out, 2 hours, 3 hour session. This is, if you know what you're doing, you can get a lot of content in 75 minutes, come back to the session again in a week and build upon it. Because all of the detail that Nathan has shared in the written notes, you would be a struggle to get in one session. This is a repeated session, but it's not trying to get it all in 90 minutes and never see it again. It would be multiple 75 minutes for me. That's how I would go about it.
That's a great point, because I set it for 80 minutes approximately. But those notes are just guides for us as coaches to say, all right, where do I need to focus my attention today? Right. So these are the things I would love to hit the whole session, but maybe the 9 and the 10 are doing a pretty decent job of it already, but the 6 is struggling. Right. That means probably more of your attention from a coaching standpoint is going to be shifted towards the 6, and then you can keep layering things for the other players. So that's a really good point, because that's a lot, right? Trying to get to all that, the kids wouldn't be playing very much.
That's right. It's a great point, and it almost brings us full circle in a way, just in the sense that your session that you've presented today is tied to a bigger picture within the context of your season. So it's not the be all and end all to teach every single point, within that 80 minutes, because there is a more global picture and a more global journey that you're on, and at some point you're going to revisit. So I think that again just ties into the importance of the context, and the periodization of your whole season, which you mentioned right at the very beginning. So
yeah, I love that. Well, Nathan, it's your again my first experience getting to know you a bit. You're extremely high level. I'm blown away. And so I would recommend to everyone, watch this twice, because there's probably some stuff you've missed. Check Nathan out, who's on the Corn-Fed Coaching Podcast. So that episode is out there with Jack and John. Definitely listen to that. And just a quick shout, I think in COVID times, especially here in Iowa, a lot of our small businesses are really struggling. And I just did want to give a shout out to anyone. Brewing Company. I've been from their Contradiction. It's very delicious here on a Friday afternoon after a busy week. But all you out there, probably your small businesses and local breweries and restaurants are struggling as well. So hit them up, even if they're closed. We went and picked this up, and we'll run there again later on today, pick up another 4-pack and head to another couple places. And so these people need our help the same way our families are sticking with us through these times as well. So If no one else has anything, I think that might be our effort here on the 7th episode of the Sesh. And from all of us here at Cornfed Coaching FC, we wish you well. Have a great week. Stay safe.